Hi, Dr. Zenobia Storah. Thank you so much for being my guest today. Can you tell the viewers and listeners out there a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name's Zenobia Storah. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been working with children and adolescents, which is my speciality, for about 15 years now. So I have a wealth of experience working within children's services, within the NHS, both as a private contractor and also previously as an NHS employee. Currently, I have a private practice, but most of my work is within the NHS. I'm working with children mainly with neurodevelopmental conditions. So those are children with ADHD and autism. And other kind of complexities. But I also see children and adolescents for therapy with conditions such as depression, low mood, self-harm, those sorts of presentations.
Well,
So yeah, I have a variety of things that I do, and I provide expert witness reports for family courts as well when
right.
children are going through the care system.
Well, thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask you, over the past 2 years, since the start of the pandemic, what have you noticed? Have you noticed an increase in what have it, essentially, what has your findings been since you obviously provide therapy for children and adolescents? Have you seen an increase in the demand for therapy?
Yes, absolutely, I have. There's it's been, and again, this has now been backed up, widely with numerous studies which are showing the impact of the last 2 years on children's mental health. So there've been a lot of, reports generally about the increase in children's presentations and anxiety disorders and so on. But in terms of my personal practice, yes, I have. I've received I've received so many referrals. I can't see the children that are referred to me, then that has been quite apparent. Since about January last year, I became really aware that I was getting double what I could see, sometimes triple what I could see, in terms of my private practice.
Right.
In terms of my work in the NHS, because most of my work is, I'm commissioned by CCGs to carry out assessments and interventions for children within the NHS. So I see that population too. And the children that I've been seeing there are children, as I was saying earlier in my introduction, are children with learning disabilities or complex needs, neurodevelopmental conditions. And those were the issues that really concerned me at the start of all of this, because when the schools closed, which we can talk about in a bit, and
Yeah.
the concerns that I and I think many other psychologists and healthcare professionals have had at that time. Those children and those families were particularly vulnerable, and I was very aware of that because those are children who are in special schools, and in the first lockdown the special schools did close as well. So you had families with a number, and often these conditions can be genetic. So you have families who are dealing with a number of children with really complex needs who all of a sudden all their services stopped. They had families lost their respite care, they lost their face-to-face contact with social workers, support workers, the schools closed. And for these children too, it's particularly difficult to cope with change in routine and so on, and the demands 24 hours a day on families. So I was very aware of that, and I was very aware of the pressures and the distress within those families at the beginning. And certainly when we were back in clinics, and I went back as soon as I possibly could. So I went back in June 2020. I know lots of professionals didn't go back. I was lucky, I think, in a sense that I could make that choice for myself because I wasn't a direct employee of the NHS. So I
Right.
made that decision along with the agency I work with, that I would offer face-to-face because I felt comfortable to do that. And when I was back in clinics, I was, getting those stories from families about how they were struggling. And then towards the end of that year, the end of 2020, I started to see families who had not seen anybody. They'd come to the clinic and they'd not seen a single professional face to face since the start of the pandemic. So families who'd been completely isolated with, they may be getting the odd phone call, but they'd be getting nothing. And these are people who were really complex and they needed lots of support. So I was very aware, in terms of my personal practice, I was very, very aware of that level of suffering, along with my general concerns from my own experience about and the knowledge about what schools do and what services do and how important those things are. My sense of the suffering generally across the population. and concerns that these things weren't really being discussed or acknowledged sufficiently.
Wow, yes. No, it's shocking what families and went through, and children, adolescents, and obviously those that needed the most, care and support didn't get it. It's so shocking. I understand you're part of the Heart group. Could you tell me a little bit about that group? Um, Sort of how you got involved, and obviously the reasons why you did get involved.
So the Heart Group is an organisation that was set up at the end of 2020, and that was bringing together a number of people like myself, and we were very much a minority. So professionals in various academic areas of expertise relevant to the pandemic. So whether that be healthcare professionals or medical professionals, or people with expertise in economics, and so on. So people with different expertise that was relevant and we felt informative to the debate. I'm very much aware that there wasn't a debate going on. So for
And
me,
this so just to interrupt, this is about a debate about the government's COVID-19,
yes,
right? Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, sorry to clarify that. Yes, so I think that for a number of people, and I think lots of us have felt quite isolated individually in terms of our own immediate professional experience and contacts and the people we see day to day, and even amongst family and friends. Certainly over the course of 2020, I felt increasingly concerned and alarmed, and also really upset by the fact that issues which I felt were absolutely obvious and apparent in terms of uh, the health of the population, the psychological health of the population, were not being discussed. Now, other people within that group have expertise in different areas, and be they medics and epidemiologists, and they may be able to talk about things which as an interested and informed layperson, I'm interested in those issues,
Yes.
and I'm very interested to hear people say this isn't the right way, for example, to go about dealing with this particular public health issue. But that's not my expertise, so I listened to that, and I've got great respect for that. And I, like I think many people, would like a big public debate, an open public debate, and wanted that at the time about, was this the right thing to lock down? Was this the right thing to close the schools? All of these issues. But in terms of my experience and what I can talk about, and it was just so reassuring and comforting to find other professionals who had those concerns. I could talk about the issues to do with psychological health, and in particular that of children, and the impact on children's safety, both physically in terms of their safeguarding,
Yes.
and their psychological health and development, and so on, as a
Yeah.
result of government policy. So those were my concerns, and it was through online contacts, really, that it was increasingly obvious to me that debate was shut down, not just publicly in terms of, in the mainstream press and media, but amongst professionals too. It was very difficult to express any views online, for example, in forums or professional chat groups. If you made any comment that suggested that you were critical of government policy, it was very difficult to proceed from there, and it could become you could feel very isolated. And it
Yeah.
was through, and it could get quite abusive too, as unfortunately is the way of online communication, really. And social media, but it was through kind of making these comments, or reading certain things, or liking certain articles that the odd person put up, that a few people came together, and a psychologist contacted me via messenger, and one of these I guess like-minded professionals, and asked me whether I would join Heart. So it was through that, and that was a great relief to find those people, because I still feel like that. It still feels to me that we haven't really moved on. It's quite difficult still to voice professional concerns about things that have happened. And my great concern now is, particularly, obviously, the world has become even more complicated now with the terrible events in the Ukraine and so on. But it's very concerning for me that we learn the lessons, and the idea that all the issues that have come to pass, and all the the terrible outcomes that we're now seeing through research, which is confirming all the things that we were worried about. I'm just hoping that isn't swept under the carpet, because we need to learn lessons from this. And in particular, my view is that we never, ever should have closed schools, and that we never, ever should do that again. And I am heartened that there are a number of MPs, including Robert Halfon, who have expressed that view and are pushing hard on to lobby for that position.
Going back to the therapy that you were providing these children, did you notice an increase in sort of self-harm and behaviors like that during, over the past 2 years?
Yes, so if I could divide my work into two, which is how it works. So in terms of the families I was talking to you about before, so those families are the families that come to me through NHS work, and the children with neurodevelopmental conditions. So with those children, we were seeing an increase in distress, and that would be expressed in different ways to do with challenging behaviour and so on.
Yes.
Parents struggling to manage the behaviours of their children and the pressures of the situation. So then in turn that would exacerbate difficulties. So I saw those sorts of problems in the clinic. But what I saw, and also I can talk to you a little bit as well about the school refusal and the children dropping out of school from that group as
Yes.
well
Yes.
shortly.
Yes. We were
So in
definitely
terms of,
talking about that. Yeah.
yes, because a lot of the children struggled to go back to school once they were, those children, the children in that group struggled to go back once schools reopened,
Sure.
for a number of reasons which we can discuss. In terms of my private practice, the children, I had lots of referrals for children with OCD and so obsessive compulsive disorder for those who are not au fait with these acronyms, and health anxiety behaviours. The children that it's mainly teens that I see in therapy privately. All the young people that I was seeing at the time, they're particularly over the January lockdown last year, so the January to March lockdown,
Yes.
when the schools closed again after Christmas, every single young person I was seeing in therapy, their problematic behaviours were exacerbated over that period, through the stress, I think, of the situation and being out of school and struggling to manage difficult thoughts and feelings, when they were shut down in their homes. So so self-harm, as you say, low mood, depression, anxiety disorders, those are the problems that you would see coming through, and which reflects what I've seen in that my personal experience reflects what I've read too in the reports that have come through from ONS and so on.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, obviously, we know that the government really, really reinforced the sort of the state of fear and panic, I could say, in the country, with their sort of, the way they advertise, the way they sort of, in a sense, marketed, advertised their sort of stay at home, and if you leave the house, people can die in the early days. Did you pick up on any of the children that you saw who had this sort of very inflated sense of fear, and were maybe afraid that they were going to die and they were going to catch the virus, and maybe just even the whole thing of virus with germs? And was there sort of an increase in that type of behavior of not wanting to touch anything? Or I'm just curious.
Yes, I have seen that, and I've had that talked about since. So when I have new patients in the clinic at the moment, the children, and autistic children particularly, so the kind of the high functioning autistic children are able to tell you about these things. So and part of the presentation with autism, if you don't know, is what we call restricted and repetitive behaviours. So children can become quite fixated, and they can find it quite difficult to move on from certain ideas or certain thoughts that they attach to. So I had quite a lot of children who when parents came through would say, I've really struggled to get them out of the house because they've been so fixated and so anxious about COVID and the impact upon themselves. So I've had that. I think something that's, I think if you don't work with children therapeutically, that you might not necessarily think about is that children don't come on their own, they come as part of a system. It's a bit different to working with adults. When you work with adults, you work individually with an adult generally. I mean, unless you know the person's come because they're wanting family therapy or marriage counselling or something like that. But with children, you assess the system, you look at the system that they're in. You know, children's behaviour is evidently very much impacted by the behaviour of adults around them and by the beliefs and the values of the adults around them. So some things that I have seen and heard have been to do with adults' fear, who have, you know, they're the ones who are, you know, mainly taking in the stuff that's on the news. Obviously, there were some very insidious messages that were put out directed at young people too, and children, which I think was a particularly abhorrent aspect of government messaging. But a lot of the fear messaging that was aimed obviously at the general population and adults was absorbed by adults and then reflected within family homes and family practices, and that stuff is psychologically damaging. So I did see, for example, I had and she was actually I think she worked within the NHS, and perhaps particularly anxious around this was the mother of one of the children that I came across over the pandemic. But in their family, when the children came in from school, all their clothes were immediately taken at the door. They were put in the washing machine straight away. The children were straight away in the shower. And this was still going on, you know, a year into the pandemic. And it's that sort of behavior. You can imagine, it doesn't matter if somebody comes to you and saying, my child is very anxious, you know, you can do all the cognitive therapy in the world till the cows come home in your session, but if that's what's going on at home, that's not going to make any difference, really, is it? So you're working with the family in that way. I've come across families where they were eating separately at different times so that they wouldn't contaminate each other potentially. So teenagers having slops in the kitchen where they would go in and separate cutlery, you know, quite extreme measures being taken because the adults in the family were afraid, and were anxious about contamination. So yes, those sorts of behaviours. And as I say, when you're working with families, you've got to take that systemically. That's what we say in psychological therapy. You take a systemic approach. So you'd be talking to the family. You want to be reducing their fear in order for them to be able to help their child.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask you, I've been reading reports, and I've read somewhere that I think close to 100,000 children never returned to school, even when the schools reopened. And these are considered, and they use the term ghost children. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, this was one of my greatest concerns at the start, actually, when schools closed in 2020. And I think that anybody who works with children within the education system would have immediately felt very worried for the most vulnerable children that they'd come across in their career the moment that Boris Johnson announced that everything was shutting down in March. That was the first thought I had, the first thought that various colleagues I have who are social workers would have had, is you immediately think about the most vulnerable. And something that was not appreciated, I think, by the Department of Education sufficiently, and in conversations presumably within SAGE where these, you know, the basis of these decisions were made, was that schools are not just places of education, they are places which safeguard our children. And arguably those two aims, education and safeguarding, are equally important, I would say. And you know, it's the only way that we keep tabs on the children in our society. It's the only way that we know that children are most likely to know that children are alive, that they're being fed, that they're being cared for on a basic level, is the fact that they turn up at school and an adult has an eye over them. And in this country, since 1989 and the Children's Act, it has been accepted as part of our culture within services that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. I mean, that's a really, really important aspect of the way that professionals work. And when I say everyone, that's the public too, it's everyone. We don't, children are cared for by the entire community, and it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that they're safe. So schools play this massively important role. And there are many, many very, very, very vulnerable children in this country. And you come across them, obviously, when you work with children and you work in schools and you work in the NHS, who school is what keeps them safe. It absolutely is what keeps them safe. It gives them the only place where they are in a safe routine with people who are actually looking out for their interests all the time, who can keep an eye on them. It keeps them away from influences and I guess malign influences within the community, such as child exploitation, criminality, all of these things. And it gives them the possibility of seeing there's another way. There's a route out of whatever they're living in. That there's opportunities in life and so on. So yeah, we've got all these children, and it is absolutely shocking, that number that you quote back at me. I mean, I was looking at that. So there's been a report. Robert Halfon, I was telling you, he's been. I think he's been magnificent. Along with the Children's Commission, they've been trying to highlight this issue, and it doesn't seem to be picking up as much interest as it should, in my view. So there was a report published in January this year called Lost But Not Forgotten by the Centre for Social Justice, I think, and which I think this number comes from, that's been publicised, 100,000. So I mean, they're saying that over half of local authorities have 500 children who are what they call severely absent. And we come across these children. For example, I mean, I've seen a number of these children fairly recently. These are the hardest to reach children. These are children who come from extremely chaotic homes. They come from communities where there are all sorts of dangers and influences, which make them particularly vulnerable if they're not in school and they're not in a routine and no one's got an eye on them. And I think we could have known this. I think it would have been quite predictable that, if, like I say, the conversation wasn't broad enough when the decision was made to close schools. I think that if you asked anyone working in education, they could probably immediately, I imagine most schools could have immediately named 5 children, for example, that they would have been worried to death about the moment you close schools.
Yeah.
And this has now come to pass. Now you think, well, what has happened to these children? Well, there are, in terms of mental health, I come across children who just, so teenagers who just haven't gone back. They've just not gone back, and they're in their rooms and they're depressed. They're too anxious to go. It's been very difficult for local authorities or education welfare officers and these groups to kind of support them back. But I also don't know whether those services are fully up running and getting, back into supporting children back to school yet. So I do see children who are like that, and as a result, they are vulnerable to influences in terms of drugs, alcohol, and also they're vulnerable to neglectful parenting at home and all sorts of things that they experience. But there are other children who I think have been exposed to, because they're out of school, they're being exposed to criminality. And there's been a lot written about this, and a lot of concern about, for example, children being caught up in county lines and these gangs that would exploit them. And that's always the case, and we know that. I mean, always happens, doesn't it? Is that when the most vulnerable are invisible, whether they be children or vulnerable young women or whatever, when they are invisible, there are always people who will exploit them. And I mean, that seems to have happened. I mean, I was talking to a colleague, actually, was a friend who is she's involved with a charity in a very deprived community in Manchester. And they obviously shut during the pandemic, but what they did was they offered they had youth centres in these estates, and they had youth workers that were out there engaging young people who were very vulnerable. and giving them opportunities to do things, other than, knock around the streets and get involved with things that would harm them. And as those services closed, that service closed like everything else because everything had to. And
Yes.
they've had their most vulnerable children haven't come back. They're doing everything they can to outreach, but they have not seen the children they were most concerned about since the pandemic and since those services closed. So your question, where are those children? Well, those children will be caught up in all sorts of things, whether that's sexual exploitation or criminal exploitation.
Yes, and obviously, just to, obviously last summer was a highly publicized case of the 6-year-old boy called Arthur that was murdered by his, I think, stepmother and father. And he is, would you say he's one of the casualties of
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was the first thing, that when they closed the schools, the first thing you think as a child professional is there's going to be a load of baby peas, aren't there? There will be those awful, and there have been with that little, you know who I'm talking about. I say baby pea, don't you? So that was a very, no, you don't, sorry. So that was a very, so there's a number of cases, very, very high profile child abuse cases in this country that have supposedly ushered in change. As a result, there's been a great inquiry after baby P. I can't remember what year he died. Poor little child that was tortured and murdered by parents sometime in the last 20 years.
Right.
Other cases like Victoria Climby and so on. Anyway, these cases that you have serious case reviews following them, and then there's everybody gets very upset and says we must make changes to our services and these things will never happen again in this way. Then we closed the schools, and we rendered children like Arthur really, really vulnerable to child abuse and terrible experiences. Absolutely, he's a victim, and there will be many more. I mean, there have been a few more, haven't there, that we've heard about since, and we will hear more about those children.
Yes, it is. It's shocking and very, very sad. I wanted to speak to you a little bit about the England's Children's Commissioner, Rachel de Souza. I believe a few months ago, she launched an investigation into sort of the ghost children and to sort of find out what happened to them. Do you know anything about that investigation or any update, or have you even...
No, sorry, I haven't. I don't know any update. I'm aware of the investigation, and similarly, that's I think that the work that the Centre for Social Justice has been doing, that I've just mentioned, those reports are very much about a plan about how you get those children back, how you engage, how do you work with schools to bring children back into the education system. What I think is really, really important with that, and I'm sure this was part of the work, is that it's about schools being normal again. And I think that, for example, I'm really relieved that 2 weeks ago testing in schools, so testing for COVID, that's gone. And I hope that remains that way. And many of us on Heart and other professionals who've been concerned about these things have been campaigning and lobbying for that, for testing to be removed for a number of reasons. First of all, in my view, it's like, from in my professional experience, it's psychologically unhealthy behaviour. We should not be testing healthy children and encouraging healthy children to engage in medical interventions.
And also, it's giving the impression that that child is like a reservoir of infection. Like these children are infectious vessels, and they need to be constantly tested. I mean, it's very, I would say, highly damaging to children.
Oh no, yes, absolutely. It is. That's something that it's been very strange throughout the pandemic. The measures that have been put into school, which I might point out are unevidence-based. These things have been made on, as far as I understand, I've seen no evidence whatsoever, no cost-benefit analysis, and no evidence that this was something that was actually going to make a difference to transmission in schools and so on. This stuff is harmful and unevidence-based, and it's been rolled out across the country, whether that's be mass testing of children, masking of children, making them all walk around in one-way systems, all of this stuff has created a very strange medical environment in schools. And it's actually, in my view, we're actually teaching children OCD. We're teaching
Yes,
children, training them up as a whole generation in health anxious behaviours. Utterly extraordinary. With no evaluation of this. There's no
yes,
one's evaluated this or checked
yes,
this is making any real difference.
yes.
People just believe in it.
Yes, I mean, just doing my own investigative work, I mean, there hasn't been, there is proof that actually that schools are not settings for sort of super spreaders. They're not. I
Mm.
mean, there's been countless studies and reports proving that actually no, they're not. Yet the government, has continued to sort of target schools and also primary schools, younger children as well, and as if they're sort of the super, spreading the virus. Um, it is astounding. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your views on masks, because obviously, as you know, for a long time, just until recently, whether it was in the hallway or in the classroom, and obviously in other countries where they're wearing masks at school all day, what's your views on that?
I was quite appalled by the introduction of masks into schools. Again, as I was saying before, I mean, I'm not seeing any strong evidence base for that. There was that decision was made with no clear outline of what health benefit that would bring. There was just an assumption that this would be an important part of managing risk in schools. I imagine, I think it's been an important part of managing adults' fear. I think that's what it's been about, and again through this pandemic, the emotional and social and cognitive needs of children have been totally secondary to adults' fear, which has been quite often fear that's been irrational in my view.
Would you say also about it's to do with appeasing the teachers unions as
Well,
well?
that's what it seems to be, because I can't see what else it is. It seems that these things are political decisions dressed up as science. That's what it looks like to me. I
Yes.
mean, I'm that's just my appraisal as a layperson watching this. I can't understand, because I can't see the clinical basis for it. I don't understand what the clinical argument is for masking children. But from a psychological point of view, masks are completely detrimental to children's needs in terms of their ability to communicate with each other effectively, to be able to understand their teachers, to be able to feel attuned with the emotions of people around them. It's complete. That I think this is what's been very strange. I'm talking about the kind of the broader debate. What's been lost in this completely myopic fixation on COVID transmission, and plus, as I said, that many of the mitigations being put in place, I don't even know whether they've impacted COVID transmission. But that's been the argument, hasn't it?
Yeah.
But there are many other areas of science, social science or medical science, which have been totally ignored. So when we are thinking, I was saying to you, mentioning the Children's Act before, in this country, we had a culture pre-pandemic where I think we could have been very proud. It's one thing I was proud of about this country, because I've seen how it works within the health service, the education system, and the legal system when I've worked in the family courts, that children's best interests were paramount. And that is what we signed up for when we, as a country, we ratified the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child in 91, I think. And that has been the assumption, and that has been reflected throughout the culture of our services where children are present.
Yeah.
And I think that's something to be extraordinarily proud of. And for some extraordinary reason, that was just chucked out of the window
Yes.
on the 20th of March, or whenever it was, 2020. All of that was forgotten, and forgotten shamefully by many child professionals, in my view, and many organisations and institutions which should have been saying, hang on a minute, are we not thinking about children's best interests? Now, when it comes to masking, that's an exact case in point. That I don't understand the argument for putting to restricting children's communication. I mean, schools are, as I was saying, schools are places for safeguard, and places for education. They're places for social education, to socializing. Children go to school to learn to be pro-social human beings, to learn how to interact with people outside their family, to learn how to develop functional relationships, whether they be friendships or how you negotiate power relationships with your teachers, and how you accept authority and all of those things. That's all part of becoming a functioning human being who's hopefully going to be sort of useful and happy in society. So to interfere with social development by masking children, by interfering with their ability to communicate, but also, as you were saying, masking is a particularly it's particularly visible and particularly invasive fear
Yeah.
message as well, isn't it? Because it is
Yes.
part of the fear. So if everyone's walking around in masks, you have a very clear message to every child that we're all vectors of infection
Yes.
primarily, and that we must be fearful of each other, that you have a responsibility not to infect somebody else with germs or viruses or whatever it is. And so there's a number of things going on with masking which are detrimental to children's well-being, to their, like I say,
Would
their
you
communication and also their psychology.
would you say it also impedes their learning, just their learning in the classroom? I mean, even if you,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, yes, and there's a lot of evidence. I was actually I did I did a legal report for a child who was contesting the masking rule within her school in 2021. I did this last year, and as part of that, obviously did a lot of research to remind myself of all that stuff that I'd learned a
So
long time
just
ago.
to recap, so you were involved in a sort of case where the child was protesting and didn't want to wear a mask.
Yes, yes.
For which local, are you able to disclose which local authority?
Yes, it's out in the public. It's out in the you can, it's public knowledge. So it was it was a, an academy trust in Sheffield,
Okay.
and I can send you the
And it
information
was it
after.
was a secondary school.
It's a secondary school,
Right.
and the young person was contesting the school's rules around masking, and that went that yeah, and it wasn't successful. And this was another thing that was quite frustrating, I think, throughout this process, is that I think that, like I was saying, the institutions which I feel have failed. Like I was saying, I thought that we thought children's best interests were paramount, but I've seen professional bodies, in my opinion, failing children. I've seen individual, organisations such as schools failing children. I think the legal system has failed children. I think we have completely lost sight of what matters. But yes, I was involved with this case, and and again reminding myself through writing that report for the court about how important facial expressions are in the learning environment. I mean, it's the way in which something that you probably, I don't know if you've ever, since this whole Zoom world that we've now entered, whether you've I've done some training, for example, recently, where everybody turns their cameras off. So you're doing you're introducing and you're talking to people, and you've just got this blank screen of cameras. It's very interesting, that, because you get no feedback. It's very interesting not to get feedback when you are communicating.
Yes.
You feel quite lost, don't you? It's very
Yes.
interesting as a and it made me think about the masking situation and what I'd read too. So teachers, when they are standing at the front of class, they are communicating to children in front of them, and they're picking up all the time, and there's very clear research about this, that it's one of the most important feedback loops that they have, is what they see on the children's faces. So you change your, if you're explaining a complex context, a concept to children, and you see a sea of confused faces, clearly you're going to change tack, aren't you? But
Mm.
if you are, which also is the case, that there was often a big line across the classroom with teachers 2 meters back from kids, and then the kids further back all in masks. I mean, that clearly affects the ability to, and I've had children tell me that too, that, for example, I had a young person who was experiencing extreme anxiety in school, and she was having some very kind of nasty anxious moments within the classroom, were getting very upset, and this wasn't being picked up on by her teachers, because she was towards the back of the class in a mask, they were far away, and so she was just sitting through those things, and I don't think you would have that. So I'm just giving you examples of how it works within the classroom. Also, then, obviously, if you're talking about children, children often work in groups, don't they? So they've then got to turn to each other and communicate, and they've got masks on. I mean,
Yeah.
clearly it's going to affect the teaching experience, and anybody within the Department of Education, with half an imagination should have been able to see that, even if they hadn't looked at the research. So
It
yeah.
is, I mean, from everything you're saying, it is astounding that this happened. This happened in the UK. It's really shocking. And the fact that nobody, obviously, there's groups like Heart, and the work that you've been doing, standing up for the, again, just questioning this sort of this policy. But it is a shocking that this happened. And there was no sort of debate, and it was allowed, it was accepted.
It really shocks me. I mean, it has been profoundly shocking to see the complete ignoring of, or dismissal of knowledge, which I assumed was accepted.
Yes,
We're talking about decades worth of research and knowledge and accepted fact about children's development. This isn't disputed. This was stuff that we knew
yes,
about children, and how, for example, how malleable their brains are and how important these years are for them. And if you instill fear into children when they're young, you set course for all sorts of psychological problems potentially. But we've actually
it
literally
impedes
done
their
this to.
development, doesn't it?
Yes, this it does. Everything we know about early development and trauma, children not feeling safe, all of this stuff. It's very basic stuff. Everybody who has done any training and working with children will have covered this stuff in development. It's all, from John Bowlby onwards. This has been accepted now. This is, and within schools, there were all sorts of initiatives such as Thrive and trauma-informed schools and these sorts of things, where schools were kind of got up for this stuff, really thinking about the impact of early experiences and the experiences they gave children, and the impact upon their mental health in the future. Because most poor mental health starts in childhood or adolescence. These are really important times, and like I was saying to you, it seems to be very extraordinary that it's been like a really odd experiment, a completely unethical experiment, to bring
Yes,
in lots of unevidence-based measures which you could work out were harmful because
yes.
of everything we know, and then you just roll that out across a generation of children. um, and there's no comment or debate on that. And not only is there no comment or debate on it, but if you suggested that you thought that that was a problem, then you would be accused of not caring about COVID, or being irresponsible because you weren't supporting government
Did-
messaging, or
I
and
wanted
so
to
on.
just stop you right there. Did you get any, from your own personal experience, did you get any sort of attack on you, back on you, if you sort of, just if you were vocal about your opposition to this?
Yes, yeah, I did. I mean, I disengaged online fairly quickly with groups that I had been talking with. So professional groups where you're having a chat and talking about this, that, or kind of almost like an informal supervision groups where you would, um, you know, prior to the pandemic, they were very useful. You've got a particular issue that presents in clinic, and you think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what other people do with that. And very
Mm,
useful resource. You go out there and 40 people come back and say, oh, this is the resources I use, or whatever. So those sorts of groups, I just disengaged because I just couldn't believe that nobody had a problem with this. They were just immediately, I think the general view, and it was the view of the British Psychological Society, is that they should support government measures because this was essential. We were in a crisis and this was absolutely essential. And that the role of psychology was to mitigate the damage by, by, helping children manage within the confines of the restrictions. And then obviously, presumably, they would be then talking about moving towards recovery now. But there didn't seem to be any place for a view where you actually are questioning the restrictions in the first place. It's always, to me, felt like they were missing the point. I didn't want to be going along with, for example, face to face, the idea that I stopped doing face-to-face appointments with children. I mean, I just don't, I just think that's wrong. I think that I was, I'm relatively young, I'm healthy. It was really obvious in March 2020 that it wasn't people like me generally who were dying of COVID.
Yes.
Um, and
Actually, the average
therefore,
age of death was 82.5 years was the average age.
yeah, and it was very clear, wasn't it? It was very clear early on that. And I didn't feel any sense of personal danger. And I could see that little children weren't in danger either. But what they did need, what they were in danger of, is being cut off from support.
Yes,
That's what they were in danger of. They were
yes,
cut and being terrified within an inch of their lives. That was the risk to them. So
yes,
for me, I felt that it's a, and also I'm a very great believer in vocation. I think you sign up to a career and it's your vocation. That's what you do. It's not that you say, oh, I'm not doing that because I'm a bit scared. It's
mm,
if unless obviously you have a genuine reason to be. But for me, I felt that my job was to be back face to face with children and seeing, doing what I do with them, and they don't engage on Zoom as well. And that's completely irrelevant. Most of my clients, the idea that you see them virtually, I don't want to see them virtually. I want to see them in the flesh,
yes,
and to be engaged in a normal human interaction with them where they can see my face and I can see theirs.
yes,
So yeah, I think it's been very shocking because what it actually has been a thing that shocks me throughout the pandemic, because there's lots of things. I think for many of us it seems like, from the things you're saying, it sounds like you have similar views. But I've obviously felt as a layperson very concerned about government policy, and very surprised by the extent to which the population were prepared to go along with all sorts of
yes,
extraordinary infringements on their, personal lives and
yes,
dignity. But what has shocked me most has been those people who were supposed to be working for children and for children's interests not speaking out for them. And actually, I'm like, when I say not speaking out for them, it's not even, I don't think they even thought they needed to. I think there's a genuine belief, which seems to be completely astonishing to me, that that was the right thing to do. And a denial, I think, of the wide ranging impacts of these
yes,
mitigations, of these measures on children. So
yes.
it's been very shocking.
Yes. Well, look, thank you so much, Dr. Storah. I really appreciate your time and everything you've said. If there's anything else you'd like to add, please do so now.
No, I think that's it's really good to be able to get the opportunity to speak about this. I think I do have a concern that a lot of this is going to be swept under the carpet. I mean, in my naivety last year, I kind of thought that maybe things would get better, and then people would be able to reflect as a society and think, what did we do, and was that the right thing? And goodness me, maybe it wasn't. I I now I'm worried that won't happen. I just feel that people have moved on, and also I think that I think probably there's a defensiveness, isn't there? I think that if you've supported restrictions that are harmful, then you'll always find a way to justify the fact that they were
Yes.
necessary, or to minimise the harm. But the issues that you've raised today, in particular, you talk about those 100,000 children who are not back in education. Um, that's a national catastrophe.
It
That
is.
is a national catastrophe. The amount of of harm and suffering that it will be caused by that, and then that's all down on the Department of Education for closing the
Yeah.
schools and closing them again, when they didn't need
I
to.
know. It was that
So
second time. I mean, in the beginning, you can say, well, people didn't know what was going on. We were sort of in this fog of war, so to speak, when people didn't know. But I would say the second lockdown and the schools being closed for what, close to, was it 3 months, from sort of
yeah,
January to March, all schools, is so shocking and so highly damaging. And I guess, children's best interests were completely trampled on, I would say.
but
Um,
they were, and then they were only allowed back. The caveat for coming back was all these harmful measures we talked
yes,
about. So you can
yes.
come back, but you've got to wear a mask, and you've got to engage in really, health anxious behaviours like testing yourself every
And
week.
also the
Um,
constant hand sanitizer. There were all
yeah,
those hand sanitizer stations to so walk into the classroom, you had to leave it. I mean, that constant, sanitizing of their hands. I'm
that
sure.
one really concerns me, because, and that's interesting, that one, because I haven't heard a lot about that. And my son is in primary school, my youngest, and he still has to sanitize I presume it must be, I was trying to work it out with him the other day, it must be about 12 times a day, because it's every time he goes in and out of a room, they're supposed to sanitize. Now, again, that's yet another measure that, where did that come from? That was presumably an arbitrary decision by the school leadership team or the local authority? I don't know. But has anyone done a risk assessment on this in terms of the impact on children and their behaviours? Has anyone thought about whether hand sanitizer is safe for children used in
Yes.
that quantity, in
Yes.
terms of what they're breathing in or what they're putting on their hands?
The
Um,
chemicals. Yeah.
and also, has anyone done any evaluation to see whether this has made any damn difference? It's this stuff, it's still there. So there's still the kind of stuff that's hanging around schools still. And so one of the questions that we didn't quite finish, which I'll just say, is that when you were saying about Rachel D'Souza and this plan to get the children back, I think that these things need to go, right? Because what concerns me is that when you have a school environments have changed. We've still got these anxious behaviors in the environment that are hanging on still, and presumably all we're going to need is a little outbreak anywhere, and half the schools going to be bringing all these things back, aren't they? So you're creating these kind of quite unwelcoming, stressful environments, and also schools then are focused on things which they're focusing on that stuff. They're focusing on the bringing these things in and transmission, rather than thinking about the children who really need to be brought back into schools. And the other thing about closing schools, just briefly before we finish, is something I've been very aware of, and this I think this goes for every child in the country, because I've seen this with my own children. Okay, so my own children are, in a home where we value education and we're supporting them to go to school and so on. And even within my family, there's been a kind of sense, and I sometimes have had to remind myself that school is a bit optional. That's what it feels like. That's the message that's been given by this government, is that it doesn't really matter.
And also that schools aren't essential, because if you remember, they only kept essential services open, like the supermarkets, and but you would assume that schools are essential, but you're telling children by closing them, actually, your education isn't really essential. Going to school isn't that important.
Oh, well, it is, and exactly. And I think that having, obviously we're talking about before about these 100,000 children that are severely absent from schools, but I think I imagine there's going to be currently that there'll be a lot of people just off for a day, because it feels a bit optional, and particularly when schools weren't functioning properly, where everyone's off because so there's the supply teachers in because there's teachers out, and that's the problem with testing, was you had people testing and then off because they're asymptomatic, which disrupts the whole school system. I mean, my kids were going into school and they weren't even getting proper lessons all day because it was supply teachers, because all the teachers were at home isolating. So that being the case, and what they're saying to me, oh, do I have to go in today? There's no point going in, is there? I mean, part of you's thinking, no, there isn't, and that's if that's happening in my home, imagine what's happening. Imagine the message that's been in homes where they don't value education, or where their children are not being encouraged to go to school. You just think, well, what's the point?
Yes, I wanted to just ask your opinion, what your thoughts are on online learning, because obviously during when the schools were shut down, they sort of, the excuse was, well, education isn't being sidelined, we've got online learning now. What's your sort of, do you have any criticisms, or I mean, what are the pros and cons, would you say, for online learning, or are there any positives?
I think it's a total fantasy. I thought it was a bit of that exactly, that was the justification, wasn't it, of Gavin Williams' department? Well, we've got high quality online learning. Well, I think anyone with children over that period would have big questions about that. I mean, and again, I was trying to hold down a job, and I got 4 children, and 3 of them in secondary school. You're having to, I'd be going, I'd start my working day, I'd go upstairs, and my teenage son would be in bed with the curtains closed, teacher blasting out on Zoom, but his camera off. And I expect that every single child in his class was all in bed. We're all in bed. This was at 9 o'clock. They just learned to stick it on, didn't they? And the idea, it's just the idea that children were all sitting there with their pencils poised at 9 o'clock, it's just ridiculous. And plus the fact is, we know that ourselves, don't we? If you have a day on Zoom, it's very exhausting. It's actually quite hard to engage that long with that kind of interaction on a screen, isn't it? So
Yes.
I think it's unrealistic, and it was a very, very poor substitute, and there may have been a place for it, right at the beginning, like you say, when they needed to do something. But it should all the idea that it was satisfactory and that was a reason why you could close the schools again in January because you could offer that again, was wrong. And again, as we've talked about before, just all the other things that are lost, the interactions with teachers, the awareness of, children's needs, anything that might be going on for them, all of that stuff. So, no, I hope that we never consider that to be an adequate substitute again.
Yes, yes. Well, really, I thank you so much for just, just speaking extensively on this topic. And yes, thank you so much for your time, Dr.
No
Storah.
problem.
Take
It was
care.
nice to speak. Thanks, Sonia.